All right, guys, Lewis here, and today we have a very special guest in the field of vocabulary. It's Norbert. I'll let him introduce himself a little bit later, but today we're going to talk mostly about vocabulary because my guest is one of the most prolific academic in the field of vocabulary. So, if you're looking for language learning advice, this is really going to be a great interview. I'm going to put all of the takeaways from this interview on my website at loistalagrand.com. So I'll put the link in the description. All right. So Norbert, could you introduce yourself and tell people why they should listen to your advice when it comes to learning a language?
Okay, that's a really good question. It's probably the first one you should always ask. Hi, I'm Norbert Schmitt. I'm a retired professor of applied linguistics. I taught at the University of Nottingham. Um, and I'm interested in just about everything to do with vocabulary. Now, why should you listen to me? I guess the main reason is I've been looking into vocabulary issues since 1990 when I was a language teacher in Japan. I taught English there and just got really interested in vocabulary and helping people learn vocabulary and words. So I started researching at the MA level, and then I went to the University of Nottingham and studied there and did my PhD on vocabulary acquisition, finished that in 1997. And after that, the University of Nottingham hired me. So I stayed there and I've just been doing vocabulary research. So I've been thinking, talking to people about it for, what does that mean? Like 30 years now. So I hope I've learned something that's useful that would be good for you to listen to.
Nice. I think now that people are convinced that you're an authority in this field is, because when you learn a language, vocabulary is just one aspect of a language. You have grammar, you have, pronunciation. My personal view, my experience is that vocabulary is the most important, or maybe not the most important, but at least the biggest obstacle, just because of the sheer volume of words that you need to learn. It feels like the grammar is somewhat manageable and improving your pronunciation, that's, pretty limited in scope, but vocabulary is just just a mountain of words to learn. So is this also your view? Do you think that vocabulary is really the biggest obstacle in language learning?
Yeah. Well, I think you said two things. It's the most important and it's the biggest obstacle. And I think both of those are right. Now, of course, I'm going to say that because I'm a vocabulary guy. You get the grammar guy on, he's going to say that's important. And grammar is important. But let me tell you why I think vocabulary is so key. Okay. One reason is I look at language as meaning based. What do we use language for? We use it for communication. Okay. So we want to transact meaning. We want to, say things that mean stuff to people. Vast majority of meaning in language is encoded in vocabulary. So without vocabulary, it's almost impossible to have any meaning other than, maybe again, just expressions or gestures. Okay. So if you believe in, language and communication, is meaning based, obviously you should focus on the aspect of language that carries the meaning the most. And so that's one reason why I think vocabulary is the key. And okay, I'm a researcher. And if we look at the literature, there's plenty of research that shows that vocabulary is the main aspect that is important for communication because, it's meaning based. So I could show you statistics, vocabulary correlate with the ability to read, the ability to speak, write, stronger than almost anything else. Now, grammar correlates as well, of course, pronunciation, they all correlate. Language is everything. But again, vocabulary is at least as strong or stronger than any of the other aspects. So that's why I think vocabulary is really, really important for language learning. Now, the second thing you said was, it's the biggest hurdle. And I think that's exactly right as well. Grammar, grammar is hard to learn. That's one reason I got into vocabulary because I couldn't understand grammar. So, but it's a closed system. There's a limited number of rules and regularities. But vocabulary, in order to use, let's talk about English, because that's the language that I research. It takes thousands and thousands of words, and it's probably one of the things Well, maybe here's the time to tell you. So, like, how much vocabulary does it take to do things in English? Because that's what we're interested, right? In language, what we're interested in is not can you pass a test, you know, can you do something that you want to do in that language? That, could be any language, French, German. But if we're talking about English, okay, how much vocabulary do you need to know? Well, if you just want to travel overseas to an English speaking country and order some food, get, a room at the hotel, maybe 1 or 200 words, being able to count to 10,
Really? Okay.
use your gestures. So, maybe, a few hundred words. Phrases are really important
Yeah.
because
Yep.
you're all familiar with like, little travel guides and they got phrases in the
Uh-huh.
back. If you learn, a number of those and some keywords, you can probably get, kind of get along survival in a survival manner with, like I say, maybe, 100, 200 words. But that's where, the situations are really constrained. You know what's happening. There's no surprises. But once you get into, communication where you don't exactly know what's coming, you have to, interact with other people, then you need a lot more. So how much? Well, again, it depends on what you want to do. If let's say you want to read in English. Well, if you can buy graded readers in English that you can read with 1, 2, 300 words, but they're simple. If you want to read more widely, like newspapers, magazines, a wide range of things in English, then we're talking, the figures are, 8, 9,000, 10,000 word families. Okay, now that's the term word family. That means like you got stimulates a verb, but stimulation's a noun. Stimulated is the past form. So the family is that whole cluster of words that have the same
Yep.
meaning, but it might be a noun, might be a verb, might be an adjective. So it's not just, it's one family, but it's probably like 8 or 9 words, right? So anyway, to be able to read widely, maybe, we're up in the 8, 9,000 word families. So that's a lot. If you want to be able to read, but maybe use the dictionary, have the teacher help you, maybe you can get by with about 5,000. Okay. So the punchline of this is it takes a lot of vocabulary. So this is why it's a hurdle. It takes a lot of vocabulary to do things well in any language, but particularly English, because English has a wide vocabulary. Listening and speaking, probably less because oral language is less dense,
Uh-huh.
has less kind of vocabulary variation than written language. And it makes sense, right? If you're listening, you got to like pick it up as it comes. You can't like put the person on hold and what was he saying? When you're reading, you read, what was that? You can go back. So basically, when you're reading, you're in control of your speed of the input, right? But when you're listening, it's real life. You have to get it as it comes. So oral language is just easier. It's less complex, has less variety of vocabulary. The grammar structures are easier because it has to be. Okay, so maybe you can get by with 3,000, 3,000 sort of like everyday conversation. But again, if you want to listen to a university lecture or something that has a lot of information content, then we're talking probably 6 or 7,000 word families. Okay. So that's a lot. And you just can't learn them. I don't care what any of these language programs or, you know, um, apps say, oh,
Uh-huh.
learn English in 2 weeks, 3 weeks. It's never going to happen. It takes time. So motivation is like a really key thing because if you're going to learn any second language well, it takes time. We're talking years, not
Uh-huh.
months,
Yep.
certainly not weeks. And so, yes, what you said about vocabulary being the biggest hurdle, I think that's right, because in order to get a wide vocabulary that allows you to do everything you want to do in a language, a second language, it just takes a long time and you have to stick with it and there's no way around it.
Yeah, and you said something in there that I found I'd never heard before. You said that English has a wide vocabulary. So is
Mhm.
there maybe for people not learning English, which is, the case for most people listening to this, maybe they're learning Spanish or German or Japanese,
Mhm.
but is there maybe a hope that they don't, in order to read I don't know, a newspaper in Japanese, they don't need to learn the 9,000 or 10,000 most common word families, maybe a little less. Is there some hope here?
Yeah, there's definitely hope. Now, I don't want to say anything too specific because I haven't researched it. But what I do know is, let's take a language like German. Okay. Now, German compounds words together. So, I don't speak German, even though my name's Norbert Schmitt. My mother came from Germany, but she never spoke German. So I didn't acquire it. Um, but you've got small words and you can stick them together. And even though, okay, the total number of words in German may be, similar to that in English, you can actually figure out what they are. Because if you know like what the small words are that are like stuck together, you can understand the bigger word, right?
Uh-huh.
So yes, you may need to know maybe a number of words, but the ones that you can make out with a smaller number of the components are a lot more. In English, we do put words together like, I don't know, what's a good example? Icebox. Okay, ice, box. Okay, you can probably figure out icebox is something that's cold that maybe you put food in or something, right? But English doesn't do it nearly as much as German, so you're not going to get the benefit as much. In English, it's like a good example, it's not as regular as other languages. So let's say, okay, you got the idea of stealing something, right? Okay, so the verb is steal. Okay, we all know steal, right? So what is the person who steals something? What should be a stealer, right? Farmer, swimmer. It should be stealer, but it's not. Okay. In fact, what are you stealing? Okay. If you're just a general stealer, okay, you're a thief, right?
Uh-huh.
But what if you steal intellectual property? You're a plagiarist.
I see.
What if you steal ships on the ocean? You're a pirate. What if you steal, you sneak into a house and steal somebody's TV? You're a burglar.
Uh-huh.
Pirate, burglar, thief. None of those words have any similarity to the others, right? But you need to know them, right? So this is why English has such a wide vocabulary. It's taken words from all different languages. It's borrowed a lot of words, and each of those words sort of have their own systems of spelling, pronunciations, and meanings. So English just has a wider vocabulary than other languages simply because, okay, it's it's British colonialism and then
Uh-huh.
Americans, taking over the world. So it's, the language is really, really rich, which is nice if you know it, but it just makes it much harder to become a master of because it just takes a long time to learn.
All right. So not so good news for English learners, but for most people listening to this, I guess maybe a little bit of good news because most of the figures that I usually give, and we talked about this also with Paul Nation, I think. It's if you
Mm-hmm.
want to be able to read, I don't know what it was, 98% of all written material in English, at least it's the 9,000 most common word families, but in English. So then maybe, perhaps a little bit less for German or other languages. So
Yeah,
still,
perhaps.
I think that even if, I don't know, in German or other languages, the vocabulary is less, there's less variety, then I suppose there's still, thousands of word families that you need to learn. So based on your research and, the research of others, what do you think are some of the most effective strategies for learning this vocabulary?
Study it. Okay. Um, and the reason I say that is, I guess most researchers make the main division between intentional learning, explicit learning, where you're trying to give attention and learn the words, versus incidental learning, where it's just happening, you're picking it up as you go. So this would be like, okay, reading a novel and, oh, you can learn some new words that you come across in the novel. And that's true. Or like watching videos, watching this podcast right now. There might be some new words. Okay. So incidental learning, sort of as you're doing something else using language, and intentional learning where you're trying to learn, the language. Yes, you might be reading, but you're doing it because you want to learn. Okay. So there's sort of a view out there in a lot of people or some teachers have the view that, shouldn't have, you shouldn't need to explicitly learn vocabulary. You can just pick it up from context, use language. This is a communicative approach, right? Just use language, you'll learn it. Now, it's true that if you use language, you will learn some language. You'll learn some
Uh-huh.
vocabulary. So I'm all in favor of that. Read as much as you can. Listen to podcasts, watch TV. It's all good, but the learning is slow. It's kind of insecure, and, it just takes time. So yeah, maybe if you move to a country, if you want to learn French, move to Tahiti, live there for 5 years, you're probably going to learn French. That's all you use. Okay.
Twisted
But
French, though. I'd have
twisted
to
French.
say.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, don't get me wrong. I'm all in favor of incidental learning. The problem is most second language learners don't get enough exposure. They're not moving to Tahiti. They're not moving to an English country. They're studying in their own country, maybe, reading your textbook for an hour a week, or maybe going to a language class an hour a week. There's no way that amount of input is going to give you the vocabulary size you need just from incidental learning. So what do? We study vocabulary. So I'd say the most effective way is just using word lists, or maybe the new technical way with electronic flashcards. But the research has shown that, okay, you might think, yeah, it's kind of boring, and maybe it is kind of boring, but it can be really, really effective. People can learn, in an hour, the research shows, people can learn 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 words an hour. Now, when I say learn, what I mean is start the learning process.
Huh.
And I think that's really, really key. Too many people are, use the words, learn. Okay. My students, I taught them 10 words in the class. I gave them a test at the end of the class. They got 8 out of 10. So they learned 8 words, and then they never look at them again. And they just assume those words are learned forever. Well, vocabulary learning is incremental, right? It's step by step. It takes time. It goes over time. You learn a bit more about the word every time you come across it. So if we think of vocabulary learning as kind of an incremental, gradual process, then we can see where both of those approaches are essential. One
Uh-huh.
without the other can't do it. Because let's think about learning explicitly. So what can you actually focus your mind on, look at and try to learn? Well, you can look at the spelling, you can practice your pronunciation. So that's the word form, right? Written or spoken form. You can learn the meaning, some aspect of it, at least like the dictionary meaning. You might, you can learn, okay, this is a noun or a verb. It should go in that kind of like sentence structure. Okay, that's good. So you can learn those, you can learn it quickly, but it's not enough, because in order to know a word well, you need to know other things. What other words does it collocate with? So that was probably a term that Paul Nation and others talked about. So words partner. Let's just give you an example. Okay, so let's say, okay, get up in the morning, I'm really hazy. I need some coffee with some real punch. So we could say, I need some powerful coffee. You'd understand it. Or we need some deep coffee, but we don't. We say we need some strong coffee, right? But if it's raining like crazy, we don't say it's a strong rain. We say it's a heavy rain. Okay, so that's the idea of collocations. It just means that most words in English and in most languages, they just tend to partner together, go together. And you can see why, because if the words partner together, when you hear them, you sort of can kind of predict what's coming, right? It makes it easier to comprehend, because these very common partnerships are just, you see them a lot, you hear them a lot. It's just easier to understand, quicker to understand. They're also easier and quicker to produce, because you got them stored in your memory, right? So it's almost like you got little chunks of language already prefabricated, pre-put together, which makes it easier to be fluent. You're not having to come up with the grammar and the noun and the verb every sentence you make. Okay, so collocation is something. Okay, formality. You know, if you're a guy on the beach, you don't want to be called thin or skinny. You want to be slender, right? You know, and women probably, have the same kind of thing. Maybe thin doesn't sound good. It's got a negative connotation, but like, yeah, slender or willowy sounds, very positive, right? So a lot of words have connotations as well. Those kind of what I might call aspects of word knowledge, those are hard to teach because it's almost like you got to see them in a lot of contexts. Almost start building up intuitions from, just seeing that word partner again and again. So yeah, I could tell you about it, but you really won't get that intuition or that feeling until you get a little exposure to a lot of language. Okay, so that means all that incidental learning, all that input is really important for some kinds of word knowledge, whereas explicit teaching can be really useful for other types. So what I'm saying is you need both, because some things we can teach and it's kind of easy to learn explicitly. Other things it's really, really difficult to learn explicitly. You just need that exposure. So the two approaches reinforce each other and they need each other because they do different things to a large extent. Also, the thing I'm saying that learning is bit by bit. So yes, I use my word list. I learn, kind of memorize that form and that meaning for a word. But then if I don't look at it again, I'll forget it for sure, right? So seeing it in context reinforces that initial meaning that's explicit. So the contextual learning does two things. Number one, it consolidates the explicit learning that you've already done, or any learning that you've done. But number two, it enhances it. Every time you see a word in a different context, it gives you a little bit more information about, what's a formality, what's a collocation, is the meaning a little bit different than it was in the next context. So learning in context is really useful, but it can be speeded up very much if people study like that form and the meaning initially. Because if you got that form and the meaning, if you see that new word in a book, you'll have a lot better idea what it means, right? And so then you can use that context a lot better rather than trying to guess the meaning initially. So I would say the most efficient way to learn vocabulary is explicitly study the form and the meaning, but then try to come across it in as much input as possible. And this is where teachers can come in because, I would say teachers, give your students homework, give them, 20 words before every class. Maybe even need to give them a quiz to make sure they study a little bit. But what normally happens is after the quiz, the teachers never use it again. The student's like, oh, okay, yeah, I know how this works. I'll study the word list on the bus on the way to class. We'll do the test and then I can forget it because then we'll have another test next week. So what needs to happen is the teachers, give the 20 words or whatever for the homework, maybe give a quiz. But the essential thing is now in the class, I'm going to use those words. They're going to appear in the readings. We're going to talk about them. We're going to tell stories with them. Maybe we'll have a little writing exercises where I ask the students to use that. We'll have discussions based on themes that the words are useful for. So basically make the words useful in contextual. Teachers are really good at contextualizing things, right? They got the expertise. They can select the readings. They can select the tasks. So select those reading and tasks where those words will be followed up. And if the students see that, it's like, okay, yes, I don't like homework. I don't like memorizing, but I know there's going to be a quiz and I know there are going to be these words through the whole hour class. So I guess I better learn them. So that's, I guess, kind of a long-winded reply to like how I think people should study vocabulary.
Good. Yeah. Actually, I do have a question about this because when you
Mm-hmm.
are starting to learn a language and you have the high frequency, well, ideally, if you're using a frequency list or just like
Mm-hmm.
I developed what is called the Anki Core decks. I'll put the link in the description for the listeners, but
Did you
these
say
are
Enki?
Yeah, Anki Core
Anki?
Dex.
Oh, is
Yeah,
that your
it's
program?
um it's not my program, but I developed flashcard packages that
Okay.
people can buy, and they're based on my own development. I took corpora, I mean a lot of text from a university in Germany. I lemmatized all the words and I ranked them based on sorted them based on frequency, and I
Mm-hmm.
made Anki decks, Anki flashcards out of this program. And each flashcard has a word that you want to learn in German, for example, or Japanese,
Mm-hmm.
and it has the translation, it has the audio, it has an example sentence,
Mm-hmm.
also a mnemonic. So using the keyword technique,
Yeah.
it has a word part analysis for some words when applicable. So yeah, this
Mm-hmm.
this is my attempt at making, you know, a really good resource for vocabulary learning. So people
Yeah.
can check
And
this out
is
at
it the kind of
AnkiCortex.
thing where you've got the space learning? If you get the information right, then
That's
it
right.
kind of gets pushed back toward while, but then if you get it wrong, it comes up more quickly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let
Anki
me give
takes
you a
care of that.
plug because this, I
Yeah.
think is a great resource. Because I call, in the old days, we did it with index cards and word cards and stuff. And if you got it right, then you put it back in the deck. But like now computers can like do that for you automatically. And so, and also it's like, okay, like you say, you got like the audio, you got the pronunciation. So it's like, I think these flashcards are really super way to, let's say to start the learning process, right? But if you do something like Anki and you'll get that sort of initial understanding about the words, you'll be able to like understand it so much better when you hear it or read it. And yeah, it would improve your reading and your listening to no end, I think, if you use that approach.
Yeah, this has definitely been my experience. When I started learning Japanese, I did about a
Hmm.
year of just doing sort of, you know, random methods and just textbooks and stuff. And I did get some results. I did get, you know, some vocabulary and some grammar, but then after about a year, I started using an Anki, yeah, you know, Anki flashcards
Hmm.
based on the frequency list. And I can tell you that just when I was talking with people on the internet, you know, in Japanese,
Hmm.
every time I talked with people, every session, I could just notice, you know, about, I don't know, 10 or more words that I had
Hmm.
learned on the same day on in the frequency list. So it's that helpful, really.
Yeah. Well, so I'm working on a vocabulary, my last academic vocabulary book now that I'm retired. Just
Uh-huh.
one last thing with all the things I want to say. What I'm actually working on just as we're doing this interview is textbooks. And when I'm looking at textbooks, looking at the reading of textbooks, basically the problem with textbooks are the vocabulary is a mess. It's completely unprincipled, unstructured. Because what most authors do is they try to find a jaunty, sexy kind of reading that's high interest for the learners. And that's good. We want that, right? But the problem is, okay, we got the high interest reading, like maybe the first chapter is foods, and then the second chapter is like clothes, and the third chapter is sports. And it's really, really hard to recycle vocabulary if you're jumping topics like that. And so what you find is whatever vocabulary that's being taught in that chapter is just what happens to be in that reading. And there's hardly any repetition. And we already talked about that. You need recycling, right? It takes a lot of repetitions before you really come to grips with the word. Unless you're Superman or Superwoman and got a photographic memory, that's not most of us, right? So, yeah, most textbooks are actually not very good at all for learning vocabulary. They're interested in the skills and, some one researcher from Sweden, asked textbook writers, what do you do with vocabulary? And well, we don't really worry about it. We just make, interesting
Uh,
stories, and the students would just pick up the vocabulary by using, our interesting stories and interesting textbooks. And what we know is, yeah, they'll pick up some, but it probably is not going to be very much, and it's not going to be very efficient. And the vocabulary that you get is going to be, maybe some high frequency, but a lot of it's low frequency you may never see again. So it's like you say, you need high frequency vocabulary. Why is it high frequency? Because it occurs in all different topics. It occurs a lot. So in other words, it's really useful. So high frequency vocabulary is definitely what you want to focus on.
Yeah, and so now that we've sort of established the importance of intentional learning activities like word lists or flashcards, I just want to play the devil's advocate here because
Mhm.
some previous guests on my podcast and some academics are going to say that any learning that results from flashcards and word lists and stuff like that, that's just what it is. It's just learning. It doesn't result in actual language acquisition. And so these two systems, according to these people, would be different. So anytime that you invest in doing these
Have you
intentional
been
learning
talking to
activities,
Watson?
now it's but
He's been discredited. Didn't you know that?
who are we talking about?
Stephen Krashen. See, you were
Stephen
saying,
Krashen, yes.
I thought you were saying there's a difference between acquisition and learning. Is that what you
Yeah,
were
that's right.
saying?
So some guests
Well,
have
there isn't.
said that there isn't.
There isn't.
And this is based on research.
Yeah. I mean, Krashen said a lot of good things, and I'm all in favor of what he says about reading. More reading is good.
Huh?
This idea that explicit learning doesn't help you and that teachers have no value because explicit teaching doesn't help you. You just got to read and get language in context. That's completely wrong. So, if you're going to read, reading is good. Don't get me wrong. Reading is great. But how are you going to read if you don't know the words or you don't know the grammar? And how are you going to learn those? So I always want to ask Steve, it's like, okay, reading is good, but somebody taught you to read. Nobody is born knowing how to read. We do learn to speak automatically. You don't have to be taught how to speak, but everyone has to learn how to read. So you got to study it explicitly. People have to teach you. So yeah, teaching has value. Teachers have value. So this idea of acquisition learning, that's discredited.
Right. Okay. Because I feel like now it's becoming even more popular on the internet, at least. Because I suppose if
Well,
you just have
not in the
to,
profession,
right.
not among researchers, not among academics. I mean, there's a ton of research that shows that, if you study language, it helps, that you can learn it. It shows that good teaching has value. It aids acquisition or learning, same thing. Okay, it's not perfect. If you teach somebody something, they're not going to learn it automatically. They're not going to learn it for sure, but it will facilitate learning. Yeah, that's just not controversial anymore. Nothing's completely simple.
Uh-huh.
Okay. What we do know is that, explicit, intentional learning, where you put your attention on something, whether it's riding a bicycle or learning a language, it will improve. If you actually try to do something, you will do it better than if you're not trying. Okay. Now, intentional learning, incidental learning, just input. Can you learn a language just from input without studying at all? I think the answer is probably yes. You young guy, he moves to, I don't know, Indonesia and meets a beautiful Indonesian girl. He decides, to live there and they get married. Is he going to learn Indonesian eventually? Probably yes, but it's probably going to take years. So can it happen? Yeah. Now, if he decides he really wants to learn Indonesian and he actually tries to study it, will that make that learning faster? Almost for sure, right? Well, we're if you're talking about the extremes where you just do intentional learning and you don't have any input at all, can you learn language? It's kind of hard to imagine, that you could, right? Because what are you learning language for? You're probably going to have some input, aren't you? At least you're going to hear a teacher talking or you're going to do some reading. So there's never going to be any kind of intentional learning that doesn't have input. You got to have input. Okay. Can you learn just incidentally without any attention? Yeah, but like who would want to do that? We're
Yep.
adults. We got nice minds. We actually can try to learn things. So,
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Norbert. I'm going to put all of the takeaways from this interview on my website for the
okay.
listeners at lewistelegram.com, link in the description, and I'll see you in the next interview. Thank you.